Today on CityCast DC, all right, what's the best bread in DC? Jill Nguyen, the bread lady of Capitol Hill, dove into baking during the pandemic and has some thoughts about what's coming out of her oven and beyond. It's Thursday, December 22nd, 2022. I'm Michael Schaefer, and this is CityCast DC. So Jill Nguyen, you are like a pandemic baker who's really committed to the bit. But I need to ask you first, where do you buy your bread in DC? That is when you're not making it yourself. Can you tell us your three favorites?
Oh, that's a really tough one. This might be surprising, but I don't usually buy bread.
You make so much of it. Why would that be surprising?
Yeah. I do enjoy like a little breakfast treat like croissant, or cruffin. I love Yellow, the cafe in Navy Yard. They have an amazing za'atar croissant. They do a lot of the pastry with Middle Eastern flavors. I love that. I'm a big fan of seilu. I'm obsessed with sourdough. Like, I have to make everything sourdough, and I think seilu is just obsessed with making everything whole grain, and I just am a big fan of that. Every once in a while, when I'm really, really desperate and I cannot wait 2 to 3 days to make a whole loaf of sourdough from scratch, I have bought bread from Trader Joe's before. There's nothing wrong with that.
Shocking. So you weren't even a baker until a few years ago. Now you've got a pretty big following in DC. You sell a bunch of your homemade stuff. What's your path? How'd you wind up becoming a bread expert?
I wouldn't call myself a bread expert. I have always thought of my journey as a bread education in the open. I didn't start baking until March 2020. Like any baking, I was never the person who baked cookies or baked brownies for the office. I was never into baking. Partially because I didn't grow up with it. I grew up in Vietnam. We didn't have an oven, and baking is just wasn't a thing when I was growing up. But of course, 2 weeks into the lockdown, I was getting really bored. And after work, you can only watch so much Netflix. So my husband decided to create challenges for me. At first, there were cooking challenges. Baked Alaska and, beef Wellington, and then after a while, it's like, make bread. You've never made bread. You don't bake anything. And that became something that I really enjoy. I really enjoy the process. And of course, I started making the sourdough starter like everyone else, and my first one failed. So it took me a while to get a sourdough starter going. And by the way, her name is Scarlett Doe Hansen. I felt very strongly about sharing the name of my sourdough starter because I'm dependent on her every day. And then, it's just a lot of reading about tips and tricks to make better sourdough bread and then make other sourdough treats. And I was just so into the science of it, but also the arts of it and every part of the process. I'm like a kid in the playground with this.
So you're someone who went from process to product, not the other way around.
You can say so.
So how'd you tap the market? So there you are, it's lockdown, you're cooking, you're one of millions of people posting pictures of your sourdough. And then what happened?
The summer of 2020, I was getting more confident with my bread baking. And at this point, there's a mountain of bread at home at all time. And we couldn't keep up with eating it. So we would take walks around the city, saying hi to friends from outside and 6 feet apart. And we would just drop off bread to people, to friends and colleagues and family. And then that lasted for about 2 months. And then people started being like, please stop because we're also baking over here. This is not helping, So about October, I had this idea. I was living in Columbia Heights at the time. I was about to move to Capitol Hill, but I noticed that there wasn't a place to get fresh bread in Columbia Heights. There still isn't really one. So I posted on a neighborhood Facebook group. It's like, hey, I've been baking. If you're interested, I'm open to sell my homemade sourdough loaves and donate the proceeds to charity since I wasn't doing it for the money, and it just kind of go from there. I remember I had a Google form. In the first week, I baked 19 loaves of bread. And it was really sweet, to be sitting outside wearing a mask, talking to neighbors that I never really had a chance to meet. And then I moved to Capitol Hill and did the same thing, posted on a Facebook group, and then it kind of go from there.
So tell me, you moved from one neighborhood to another. You couldn't find a nearby bakery. How's the bakery scene different in DC than other places you've been?
So I've spent time in New York and in Europe a lot, and I just love the feeling of being able to walk to a neighborhood cafe and get, a cup of coffee and maybe like a pastry for breakfast and then grab a loaf of bread so you can make lunch or, dinner later for a dinner party. And it's just not the same in DC. There are tons of bakeries in DC that do amazing pastries, but I think there's a real whole neighborhood places to get freshly baked bread, and especially sourdough bread. Of course, there are places that advertise that they do sourdough, but it's not true sourdough in a sense, because sourdough is the process, but also like there's a flavor to it, and a lot of places just kind of add things to make it taste like sourdough, but it's not sourdough.
Can I ask a question at the risk of having you like hit me over the head with a baguette or something? Can't you just go to Safeway? Like, what's the difference between bread that like a neighborhood bakery bakes that also sells coffee or something, and bread that you can buy at a supermarket that presumably sources it someplace large?
Making bread is a really simple thing. It's a practice that's been done for thousands of years. And I mean, it's flour, water, salt, yeast, natural yeast, or baker's yeast. I mean, baker's yeast is an invention from 100 years ago. So for thousands of years, it's always been natural yeast, so sourdough. And for a place like Safeway to get bread on the shelf, going through manufacturing process and shipping and get on the shelf and all that kind of thing, they have to put in preservative and also other ingredient. I mean, if you look at the label of, a loaf of honey wheat loaf from Safeway, like there's like 20, 30 things on it. And I don't think bread should take 30 ingredients.
Wait, do those ingredients make it taste worse?
A lot of it is to preserve the texture and the flavor of the loaf, but it's just really not the same, especially when you can achieve the same texture and flavor, even better flavor with 4 ingredients.
Funny that what you are into, right? Cooking, making bread, selling the bread, treating bread as a thing that should be made in a non-industrial way. That weirdly, it coincides at the same time as a lot of the people in the country have become scared of carbs, and it's a funny coincidence.
I've always been a foodie. I'm Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. Vietnamese culture is always about food. It's funny because I love thinking about our language. Like in the U.S., like you celebrate a holiday. In Vietnam, you eat a holiday. That's the verb we use, as in mm-hmm. celebrate a holiday. It's all about food. What I do, a big part of it is more about just bread. The bread is really good, and I have a ton of people telling me that I've ruined bread for them. Like they can't go anywhere else. They can't go to Safeway and pay half the price for a loaf of bread. It's just not the same. But at the same time, to be able to know the person that make your food, to know what goes in there. I do pick up from my house, and I live on a quiet one-way street in Capitol Hill. So during pickup time, like there's a line outside the house. People walk by with their kids, with their dogs. It's a little bit of party, and there's always a bit of conversation. And no matter how bad your week was, like there's a little bit of like hope, like, oh, I get fresh bread on Friday, yay, and the little like neighborhood party. And I think people live for that.
So how much do you charge?
So a loaf of bread, I mean, it's like £1.50. It's not small. It starts at $9. That's a country loaf. And then depending on how much whole grain or other additions in there, The most expensive loaf of bread that I do is called French onion sourdough. So there's caramelized onions, which takes forever. And my house smells like onion for a whole week. And then there's 3 types of cheese that goes in there. That's $12. And usually for our household too, a loaf of bread a week is plenty. And then I have other sweets and pastry stuff, all of my made sourdough as well.
It's always risky to use social media as a barometer. But are we like in a bread boom in DC?
I don't think so. There is a wave of places that offer regional taste. Like Yellow is like a Middle Eastern flavored cafe. Mm-hmm. And then there's Rose Ave Bakery, which I've had the opportunity to shadow for a few weeks. They do dessert and an Asian flavored dessert. Mm-hmm. And then there's, Shabbat and Delight, like the Armenian and the Ukrainian cafe and bakeries in Adams Morgan. So I'm seeing more people of different backgrounds opening up places offering pastries from their own cultures or pastries that we're familiar with in their own flavors. And I love that because I do a tons of donuts or different bread with flavors inspired by my culture or my childhood memories. So I think I see a trend in that, but definitely I don't think we're anywhere close to a bread boom. I would love to start one.
Well, let's talk about that. How would you do it?
I mean, I still think of it as a project because for the longest time I was working full time and then baking during the weekend. So I think of it as my little side project, but now it's my full-time thing. So my micro bakery, but I mean, one day I would love to have a bakery cafe in Capitol Hill that does fresh bread and pastry. And then at lunch, there's panini and sandwiches and pizza. But the focus has to be on bread, not, sweets or pastry. Like nothing wrong with that. I love making them. I just find bread to be the fundamental thing in what I do.
Jill Nguyen, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Mike. Great chatting with you.
Bring me bread soon.
I will.
Before you go, here's some quick news. DC advocates held a candlelight vigil on Tuesday for the 77 homeless people who have died in the district so far in 2022. That number is likely to exceed triple digits this year since the statistics reflect a 90-day delay. Last year, at least 138 homeless people died, according to the medical examiner. Meanwhile, dozens of students from the Duke Ellington School of the Arts protested this week about how the DC public school system is potentially taking over full control of the school. Right now, it's run as a hybrid, and there's a nonprofit that oversees its famous arts curriculum. The city says it needs to improve oversight and accountability, but the students argue that this would dilute what makes the place unique. Also, Arlington, yes, Arlington, is the second happiest city in the U.S., according to a new survey from the University of Pennsylvania. The survey looked at factors like personal finance, well-being, and quality of life. The result might have something to do with the fact that over half of Arlington residents earn over $100,000. Sunnyvale, California was the only city to beat it. And lastly, Colby the llama, who was apprehended galloping down Fairfax County Parkway on Tuesday, was safely returned to her owner. It took 5 animal protection police to bring her in. Staff at Fairfax County Animal Shelter say they believe she just, quote, wanted a wild adventure in her later years. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not post it as a comment on the Instagram page of one of those friends who's always posting pictures of bread? Our lead producer is Priyanka Tilve. Our producers are Meg Dalton and Julia Karen. Our newsletter writer is Kayla Cote-Stemmerman. And our hosts are Bridget Todd and me, Michael Schaefer from Politico. Music is by Alex Roldan. We're taking Friday and Monday off for the holidays, but we'll be back Tuesday morning with some special content as we count down to 2023. I'll talk to you then.